Welcome to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Tonight, we begin somewhere ordinary, not in a palace, not on a battlefield, not in a place of ceremony. We begin on a narrow medieval street early in the day when the light is still pale and the air carries the smell of damp stone, wool, and wood smoke. A person walks toward you. Before they speak, before their name is known, before their face becomes familiar, something else happens first. You understand them. You understand where they belong. You understand how they are meant to be treated. You understand whether they are powerful or vulnerable, respectable or suspect, settled or passing through. All of this is known without a word being exchanged. Because in the medieval world, clothing spoke first. This was a society that depended on visibility. Most people could not read. Documents were rare. Identity was not written down and carried from place to place. Instead, identity was worn. Clothing functioned as a public language, one that everyone was trained to read from childhood. It told others your occupation, your social rank, your gendered role, your moral standing, your relationship status, your religious alignment, and even your access to cleanliness. Nothing about medieval clothing was casual. Nothing was accidental. There was no idea of dressing for yourself in the modern sense. What you wore existed for others to see, judge, and interpret. To be properly dressed was to be understood. To be improperly dressed was to invite attention. To be ambiguously dressed was often worse than either, because ambiguity threatened order. Medieval society was structured around clear divisions: nobles, clergy, merchants, artisans, peasants, men and women, married and unmarried, locals and strangers. The boundaries between these groups were not meant to blur, and clothing was one of the most effective tools used to keep them visible. Comfort was not the primary concern. Belonging was. This is why medieval fashion feels restrictive to modern eyes. Garments were heavy, layers were many, fabrics scratched, weighed down, overheated, soaked through in rain, and took a long time to dry. Shoes hurt, headgear strained the neck, sleeves restricted movement, belts cinched bodies into socially acceptable shapes. Yet people wore these clothes daily, year after year. Not because they enjoyed them, but because clothing was social safety. To dress correctly was to signal that you understood your place in the world. It showed that you respected the order that governed everyone else. It reassured others that you were not pretending to be something you were not. In a time of uncertainty, of famine, plague, war, and sudden loss, predictability mattered. Clothing made people predictable. It reduced fear. It created familiarity. When someone approached you dressed as expected, you knew how to respond. You knew whether to greet them, bargain with them, obey them, avoid them, or offer charity. Clothing removed the need for explanation. And so medieval fashion became deeply conservative. Changes happened slowly, and when they did, they were watched closely. New styles were often associated with youth, excess, foreign influence, or moral decline. Elders complained about them. Authorities attempted to regulate them, because changing the way people dressed meant changing the way people read one another, and that was dangerous. Every garment carried meaning, but also risk. A sleeve that was too long, a color that was too rich, a fabric that was too fine could suggest ambition. Ambition, in turn, could suggest rebellion. This is why clothing laws existed. This is why communities enforced norms even without formal punishment. This is why medieval fashion was not simply personal expression, but public responsibility. What you wore told the truth about who you were supposed to be. And even when that truth felt uncomfortable, heavy, or restrictive, it was safer to endure the fabric than to challenge the message it carried. As the street around us slowly quiets, imagine the sound of cloth brushing against cloth, the low murmur of footsteps, the faint rustle of layered garments moving through air that smells of earth and smoke. This was a world where appearance was not decoration. It was identity made visible. And as we move forward through this story, we will see how fabric, color, and form became some of the most powerful forces shaping medieval life, often more powerful than words themselves. For now, let that image rest. A single figure walking down a street, understood before they ever speak. Fashion without choice. In the medieval world, choice was a limited thing. Where you were born determined where you lived. Where you worked determined how you moved through the day. And what you wore was largely decided before you ever learned to dress yourself. Clothing was not a field for experimentation. It was an inheritance passed down alongside land, labor, and obligation. People did not ask what suited them. They asked what was appropriate, and even that question had narrow answers. From childhood, medieval people learned to read clothing the way we learn to read faces. They noticed length, color, condition, fabric, and fit. These details mattered because they revealed whether someone was acting within the rules or quietly challenging them. A person dressed too finely for their station was not admired. They were suspected. Their clothes raised questions about honesty, morality, and loyalty. Had they stolen? Were they pretending? Were they trying to confuse others about who they were? Clothing was expected to match life. If you worked with your hands, your clothes needed to show it. If you prayed for a living, your clothes needed to disappear into modesty. If you ruled, your clothing had to convince others that you deserved to do so. This expectation created a world where identity was stable but narrow. People rarely imagined becoming something else because there was little visual space to explore that possibility. Even success had limits. A prosperous merchant might gain wealth, but dressing like a noble remained risky. The fabric might be affordable, but the message was forbidden. This was not merely cultural pressure. It was reinforced by law, by church teaching, and by communal enforcement. Neighbors noticed, guilds noticed, authorities noticed. Clothing was always visible, and therefore always open to judgment. What made this system effective was that it felt natural. Medieval people did not experience clothing rules as oppression in the modern sense. They experienced them as structure, as guidance, as a way of knowing who they were in a complex and often dangerous world. When everything else felt uncertain, harvests, health, safety, appearance remained consistent. Clothing made the world readable, and because most people owned very few garments, each one carried immense weight. A tunic, a shirt, a cloak, perhaps a belt or hood. These were worn daily, repaired repeatedly, and expected to serve many purposes. There was no concept of seasonal wardrobes or changing styles for leisure. Clothes were tools. They worked hard. They absorbed sweat, dirt, rain, and smoke. They were patched, turned inside out, resized, handed down. A well-kept garment signaled discipline and respectability. A badly kept one suggested disorder, poverty, or moral failure. This is where comfort becomes complicated. Medieval people were not ignorant of comfort. They understood warmth. They understood softness. They understood relief from friction and weight. But comfort was always secondary to function and meaning. If a garment restricted movement, that might be intentional. Restricted movement could signal refinement. It could mark someone as removed from labor. It could slow the body in a way that suggested authority and control. Ease of movement was associated with work. Stillness was associated with status. In this way, discomfort became a signal of privilege. The wealthy often wore clothes that were impractical by design, long sleeves that dipped into food, trains that dragged across floors, shoes that limited walking, headgear that demanded balance. These garments announced that the wearer did not need to work, hurry, or carry things. Others would move for them. Others would serve them. Meanwhile, working people wore clothing that allowed movement, bending, lifting, and repetition. Comfort existed here in a different form, not softness, but usability. Freedom to move mattered more than elegance. So comfort was not absent from medieval clothing. It was simply unevenly distributed, shaped by role rather than preference. This is why medieval fashion must be understood as a system, not a collection of trends. Every garment fit into a larger logic, a logic that reinforced hierarchy while also making daily life possible. Children were introduced to this logic early. They dressed as smaller versions of adults, learning through fabric what was expected of them. There were no playful deviations, no symbolic childhood innocence expressed through clothing. Practicality and imitation guided everything. By the time someone reached adulthood, their clothes already told a story they had not chosen, but had learned to live inside. This does not mean medieval people lacked individuality. They expressed themselves through care, repair, and subtle detail. Through how garments were worn, rather than what garments were worn. A belt tied a certain way, a hood worn forward or back, a garment kept unusually clean, a patch stitched with care rather than haste. These small choices existed within the system, not outside it. And so fashion without choice does not mean fashion without meaning. It means meaning without freedom. As you let this part settle, imagine the weight of routine, the repetition of wearing the same garments day after day. The knowledge that your appearance reassures others not because it is beautiful, but because it is expected. In the medieval world, clothing did not help you become someone new. It helped the world recognize you as someone familiar. And in a society that feared disorder more than discomfort, that recognition mattered more than ease. Wool, the fabric that built a continent. If medieval Europe had a single texture, it would be wool. Not stone, not iron, not parchment. Wool. It touched almost every life, every day. It wrapped bodies, lined beds, padded cloaks, and hung drying in the air of towns and villages. It was the sound of looms, the smell of damp cloth, the weight that settled onto shoulders each morning and was lifted off again only at night. Wool was not just a fabric, it was an economy. Across medieval Europe, sheep shaped landscapes as much as castles did. Hills were cleared for grazing, fields were divided and protected. Entire regions became known not for their cities, but for the quality of their fleeces. England, Flanders, parts of Spain and Italy. These places rose in power because sheep thrived there. From sheep came wool. From wool came trade. From trade came wealth, armies, and political influence. This is why historians often say that wool helped build Europe. Taxes were paid in wool. Rents were negotiated in cloth. Merchants traveled long distances carrying bales of it. Wars were funded through it. Cathedrals were raised with money earned from it. Yet for most people, wool was not abstract. It was intimate. It was what they wore. Almost everyone wore wool, regardless of class. What differed was not the fabric itself, but its quality. Fine wool could be spun thinner, woven tighter, dyed more evenly. Coarse wool remained thick, uneven, and rough against the skin, but both were wool, and both came with the same basic realities. Wool was warm, which mattered in a cold and damp climate. It insulated even when slightly wet. It could be layered. It could be shaped into many kinds of garments. These qualities made it indispensable. But wool was also heavy. When rain fell, wool absorbed water and grew weighty. Cloaks pulled down on shoulders, sleeves clung and dragged. The smell of wet wool lingered long after the rain stopped, mixing with smoke, sweat, and the scent of animals. Against bare skin, wool itched. It irritated. It trapped heat in summer and felt slow to dry in winter. Wearing it required endurance, and yet people did. They endured it because wool was available. Because alternatives were rare. Because survival demanded it. This is where comfort must be redefined. Medieval comfort did not mean lightness or softness. It meant warmth instead of cold, coverage instead of exposure, protection instead of elegance. Wool provided that protection. Peasants wore coarse wool because it lasted. It resisted tearing. It tolerated dirt. It could be repaired again and again. A patched wool garment was not shameful. It was practical. Each patch told a story of use, of work, of persistence. Nobles wore finer wool, often dyed in rich colors. Their wool garments draped more smoothly and smelled less strongly when wet, but they were still heavy, still layered, still demanding. Even kings felt the weight of wool. This shared fabric created an illusion of equality, but only at a distance. Up close, differences were obvious. The smoothness of the weave, the depth of the color, the way the cloth moved. Wool equalized survival, not status. And because wool was so central, it shaped daily routines. Garments had to be aired, brushed, protected from moths, stored carefully. Wool clothing required attention. Neglect shortened its life. This care created rhythm, morning dressing, evening airing, seasonal adjustments. Wool made people attentive to their environment and to time. It also made them patient. Putting on wool layers took time. Removing them did too. Movement was slower. Actions were deliberate. Bodies adjusted to weight and resistance. Some historians suggest that medieval posture itself was shaped by wool, by the need to carry weight gracefully, to move steadily rather than quickly. Wool taught bodies how to behave. And then there was labor. Before wool became clothing, it passed through many hands. Sheep had to be sheared. Fleece had to be washed, sorted, carded, spun, woven, and finished. This labor was long, repetitive, and often performed by women, children, and the poor. Every wool garment represented hundreds of hours of human effort. This is why clothing was valued. This is why it was repaired instead of discarded. This is why people owned so little of it. To wear wool was to wear time. And to wear time was to understand that comfort, in the medieval sense, was not about ease, but about endurance. As night settles further, imagine the feeling of wool resting on your shoulders. The steady pressure, the warmth it traps, the way it slows movement and quiets the body. In the medieval world, wool was not chosen, it was accepted. And in accepting it, people accepted the rhythms, limits, and structures of the world they lived in. Linen and the hidden history of cleanliness. Beneath the weight of wool, beneath the visible layers that announced status and belonging, there was another fabric quietly doing its work. It was rarely seen, rarely discussed, and yet, without it, medieval life would have been far harsher than it already was. This fabric was linen. Linen came from flax, a plant that demanded patience. Flax had to be grown, harvested, redded in water until it softened, dried, broken, combed, spun, and woven. Each step took time. Each step required skill. and each mistake ruined the fiber. Because of this, linen was never cheap. It did not glitter like silk or impress like velvet. It did not announce power. It did not dominate public space. Instead, it touched the body first. Linen was worn closest to the skin. Shirts, shifts, brays, and underlayers were made from it. These garments absorbed sweat, oils, dirt, and the friction of daily movement. They protected the outer wool garments from the body itself. In a world without modern bathing habits, this mattered deeply. Medieval people did not live without hygiene, but their hygiene followed different rules. Full immersion bathing was rare and sometimes discouraged. Water could be cold, scarce, or associated with illness. Instead, cleanliness focused on what could be managed daily, and linen could be managed. Unlike wool, linen could withstand aggressive washing. It could be boiled. It could be beaten against stones. It could be laid out in the sun to bleach. It could be scrubbed repeatedly without losing its structure. This made linen the true hygienic layer of medieval clothing. People might not wash their outer garments often, but they washed their linen. They changed it. They repaired it. They prized it. A clean linen shirt signaled discipline. White linen suggested order and respectability. Stained or neglected linen suggested moral and social failure. This is why whiteness mattered so much. White linen did not stay white easily. It required labor, time, attention, sunlight, water, repetition. To keep linen white was to prove that someone, often a woman in the household, was investing effort into maintaining the body's boundary with the world. Clean linen was not just about comfort, it was about reputation. In courts, monasteries, and towns, linen spoke quietly but clearly. It said that the wearer was controlled, orderly, and worthy of respect. And yet, linen was not always comfortable in the modern sense either. New linen could be stiff. Poorly finished linen could chafe, but compared to wool, it offered relief. It softened with use. It allowed skin to breathe. In summer, linen became essential. It absorbed sweat and reduced the discomfort of layered clothing. In winter, it provided a dry buffer between the skin and damp wool. This balance made linen invaluable, and because it was expensive, linen garments were often inherited. A well-made linen shirt could last decades. It might be passed from parent to child, altered, patched, resized, and reused. In inventories and wills, linen appears again and again, not as decoration, but as treasure. To own linen was to own time, labor, and care. This reality complicates our understanding of medieval comfort. Comfort did exist, but it was hidden. It lived beneath visible layers. It belonged to the private space between cloth and skin. Public discomfort could coexist with private relief. A noble might endure a heavy wool gown or a restrictive silhouette, but beneath it, linen softened the experience. A peasant might labor all day in coarse wool, but linen absorbed sweat and prevented sores. Linen made endurance possible. It also shaped daily routines. Linen had to be removed, washed, dried, and stored. This created rhythms within households. Laundry was physical work, often communal, often exhausting, always necessary. The care of linen became a measure of household stability, and because linen was so closely tied to the body, it also carried moral weight. Clean undergarments were associated with purity, discipline, and godliness. This association was reinforced by religious teaching, where inner cleanliness often mirrored outer order. The irony, of course, is that the most important fabric of medieval hygiene was the least visible. No one admired linen publicly. No one competed over it. And yet, without it, medieval clothing would have been unbearable. As you rest here, Imagine the sensation of linen against skin, lighter, cooler, absorbing heat and moisture quietly, doing its work without recognition. In the medieval world, much of what made life tolerable was hidden, and linen, more than any other fabric, reminds us that comfort was not absent. It was simply tucked away beneath the layers that everyone else was meant to see. Layers as architecture. In the medieval world, clothing was not soft in the way we imagine comfort today. It was not meant to disappear around the body or follow it easily. Instead, it was built, layer by layer. To dress in the Middle Ages was to construct something around yourself. Clothing was closer to architecture than decoration. It shaped how the body moved, how it rested, how it was seen, and how it survived. This layering was not optional. It was a response to climate, to limited heating, and to the constant exposure of daily life. Homes were cold, work was physical, weather was unpredictable, clothing had to compensate. And so, medieval people learned to live inside their clothes. The first layer, closest to the skin, was linen, clean, absorbent, protective. Over that came wool, sometimes several layers of it, each with a specific role. An undertunic, an outer tunic, a surcoat or gown, and finally a cloak. Each layer trapped air. Each layer slowed heat loss. Each layer added weight. The body became insulated not by softness, but by mass. In winter, these layers were thickened. Wool became heavier. Fur linings were added for those who could afford them. Cloaks grew longer and denser, wrapping the body almost completely. Movement became slower. Posture became more deliberate. Sitting and standing required awareness of fabric. In summer, layers were adjusted, but never abandoned. Modesty and social expectation demanded coverage. Sleeves remained long, necklines stayed high. Linen did more work, absorbing sweat and reducing friction. The idea of bare skin in public was rare and often shocking. This layered system shaped how medieval people experienced their bodies. Clothing did not respond to the body adapted to clothing. You learned how to walk without tripping on hems. You learned how to sit without crushing fabric. You learned how to work within restriction. In time, this became instinct. Children learned it early, by watching adults, by wearing smaller versions of the same layered garments. They learned where to place their hands, how to move through doorways, how to navigate crowds without snagging cloth. Clothing taught discipline, and it also taught patience. Dressing took time. Undressing took time. Adjusting layers throughout the day took time. Nothing was rushed. This slow rhythm shaped medieval life in subtle ways. Actions unfolded at a measured pace. Gestures were contained. Sudden movement was rare. There was dignity in slowness. Layering also created silhouette. The medieval body was not meant to appear natural. It was meant to appear ordered. Straight lines, elongated shapes, structured folds. Belts cinched garments into shape. Sleeves were cut to fall in controlled ways. Cloaks draped deliberately. Even working clothes had structure. They allowed movement, but within limits. They protected without disappearing. This mattered socially. A controlled body suggested a controlled life. A well-layered figure suggested stability. A body that spilled out of its clothing suggested disorder. This is why medieval people were attentive to fit. Garments were adjusted, taken in, let out. They were not mass-produced. Each one carried the imprint of the wearer's body over time. Clothing became personal through use, not design. Comfort, in this context, meant something different than ease. It meant being protected from cold, wind, and injury. It meant having fabric between the body and a harsh world. It also meant belonging. Wearing the right layers meant you were part of a shared understanding. You dressed like others in your station. You moved like them. You existed within the same boundaries. That shared experience created community. Even discomfort was communal. Everyone endured weight. Everyone adjusted layers. Everyone knew the effort required to live inside cloth. This shared endurance softened hardship. It made suffering less isolating. And for those who lived in luxury, layering became a display. Extra fabric signaled wealth. Long trains, wide sleeves, fur linings. These additions made movement harder by design. Difficulty became decoration. The ability to carry weight gracefully suggested power. As night deepens, imagine the feeling of layers settling around you. Not tight, but present, supporting, encasing, holding warmth close while keeping the world at a distance. In the medieval world, clothing did not just cover the body, it built a space for it to exist. The tunic that everyone shared. If you were to remove the layers one by one, if you were to look past cloaks and gowns and belts and decoration, you would eventually reach the same garment worn by nearly everyone in medieval society. The tunic. It did not matter whether someone labored in fields or ruled from a hall. Somewhere beneath the differences, beneath the signals of rank and wealth, there was a tunic. This is what made it remarkable. The tunic was the most universal piece of medieval clothing. Kings wore it, peasants wore it, men, women, children, all began their dress day with a version of the same basic shape. It was simple by design. A T-shaped construction made from straight pieces of cloth, designed to waste as little fabric as possible. In a world where every inch of textile required hours of labor, efficiency mattered. The tunic was not fashionable in itself. It was foundational. It provided coverage. It allowed movement. It served as a base upon which everything else was added. And yet, despite its simplicity, the tunic carried meaning. Its length mattered. A shorter tunic suggested labor, movement, work. A longer one suggested leisure, authority, or ceremony. Fabric quality mattered too. Coarse wool told one story. Fine wool or silk-blended cloth told another. Belts transformed the tunic's message. Cinched high or low, tight or loose, they shaped posture and silhouette. They controlled fabric and controlled the body with it. Sleeves mattered as well. Narrow sleeves allowed work. Wide sleeves suggested that work was not required. Sleeves could trail, dip, and brush surfaces, small performances of status enacted with every movement. Over centuries, the tunic changed subtly. It became more fitted. It gained buttons or lacing. It split into under-tunics and over-tunics. But it never disappeared, because it worked. The tunic was adaptable. It could be worn alone in heat, layered in cold, used for sleep, labor, travel, or ceremony. It could be patched, resized, handed down, repurposed. A tunic might begin its life worn by an adult and end it altered for a child. It might shift from daily wear to work wear to sleeping garment. Nothing was wasted. This adaptability made the tunic deeply familiar. It shaped how people understood clothing itself. Clothing was not something to be replaced. It was something to be lived with. Comfort within the tunic was relative. Linen underlayers softened it. Wool versions added warmth and weight. Fit improved over time as the garment molded itself to the body through wear. The tunic became personal, not through choice, but through use. And because it was worn by everyone, it quietly reinforced the idea that society was layered rather than fragmented. Beneath the visible hierarchy, there was a shared experience of fabric and form. Everyone knew how a tunic felt. Everyone understood its weight, its movement, its limitations. This shared understanding mattered. It created a subtle connection across class lines, even as those lines remained rigid. A peasant seeing a noble might recognize the same basic garment beneath the finery. A noble, in turn, might remember wearing a simpler version in childhood. This did not erase inequality, but it humanized it. The tunic also structured daily rhythm. Dressing began with it. Undressing ended with it. It marked the boundary between public and private life. At night, the tunic might remain on, looser, simpler, closer to sleep. During the day, it was tightened, belted, layered, made presentable. This rhythm gave shape to time. Morning meant dressing into order. Evening meant loosening that order. Clothing followed the sun. And through all of this, the tunic remained constant. It did not demand attention. It did not provoke regulation. It did not cause scandal. It simply existed, quietly essential. In a society that used clothing to signal difference, the tunic stands out as a reminder of sameness. A reminder that before power and privilege, there was fabric cut to fit a human body. As you let this part settle, imagine pulling a tunic over your head. The familiar motion, the fabric falling into place, the sense of being dressed enough to exist in the world. In the medieval mind, that was often enough. Color that could change your fate. In the medieval world, color was never decorative. It was dangerous. Long before anyone noticed the cut of a garment or the quality of its fabric, they noticed its color. Color spoke quickly. It carried meaning that could elevate a person or place them in danger before a single word was exchanged. This was because color was costly. To color cloth in the Middle Ages required knowledge, materials, and risk. Dyes came from plants, insects, minerals, and sometimes from trade routes that stretched across continents. The process involved boiling, fermenting, exposure to toxic substances, and long hours of labor. A mistake could ruin the cloth. A wrong mixture could fade quickly. A misjudged color could carry the wrong message. And yet, people continued to dye their garments because undyed cloth also spoke. Plain, natural wool suggested humility, poverty, or religious restraint. Color suggested access to time, to labor, to trade, and to skill. Red was one of the most prized colors. Made from crushed insects such as kermes, it produced rich, lasting shades that resisted fading. Because the insects had to be harvested and processed in large numbers, red dye was expensive. To wear red was to declare wealth and vitality. It drew attention deliberately. Blue came in two forms. Indigo, imported from afar, was costly and prestigious. Woad, grown locally, was cheaper but unpleasant to produce, with a strong odor that lingered in dying towns. Blue could signal devotion, trade connections, or practical respectability depending on its source and depth. Green was more complex. It was often achieved by dyeing cloth blue and then yellow, making it prone to fading. This instability gave green symbolic weight. It became associated with youth, fertility, love, and aspiration, beautiful but uncertain. Black was among the hardest colors to achieve well. Rich black required careful dyeing and often multiple processes. When done properly, it conveyed seriousness, authority, and refinement. Poorly dyed black turned brown or gray, revealing its failure. Yellow was cheap and easy to produce, but it carried social risk. In many regions, yellow became associated with outcasts, performers, or those living at the edges of respectability. Wearing it invited interpretation. And then there was purple. Purple was controlled. Historically tied to ancient imperial power, purple dyes were costly and rare. In the medieval period, laws often restricted its use to royalty or high nobility. To wear purple without permission was not just unfashionable, it was illegal. Color, then, functioned as a form of medieval data visualization. It allowed society to sort people quickly. It marked allegiance, wealth, morality, and authority. It turned bodies into signals. This made clothing a risky space. A garment dyed the wrong shade could invite questions. Was the wearer pretending to be wealthier than they were? Were they claiming status they had not earned? Were they aligning themselves with a political or religious identity? Because color was so visible, it was often regulated. Sumptuary laws specified which colors could be worn by which classes. These laws were not always enforced strictly, but their existence reveals the anxiety surrounding color. Color blurred boundaries, and blurred boundaries made authorities nervous. Comfort rarely factored into color choices. Dark dyes absorbed heat, bright dyes faded under sun and wear. Re-dyeing was costly and time-consuming, yet people chose color anyway, because visibility mattered. To be seen correctly was safer than to be invisible or misread. This is why medieval clothing often favored bold color over subtlety. Subtlety was difficult to read from a distance. Bold color made identity clear. In a crowded market or public gathering, color allowed instant recognition. It told you who belonged, who held power, who should be respected, and who could be ignored. Color turned bodies into moving signs. As night settles, imagine the glow of dyed cloth under candlelight, reds deepening, blues darkening, blacks absorbing light, each color quietly telling a story that everyone present understands. In the medieval world, color was never just color. It was risk made visible, luxury, debt, and the performance of power. Luxury in the medieval world was never soft. It looked impressive, it glittered, it caught candlelight and drew the eye, but it rarely felt easy. To wear luxury was to carry weight, physical, financial, and social. Silk, velvet, embroidery, fur, gold thread, pearls, gemstones. These materials were not chosen for comfort. They were chosen for what they announced. Power had to be visible, and visibility came at a cost. Silk arrived through long and fragile roots. It passed through many hands before it ever touched a European loom. Each mile added expense, each border added risk. To wear silk was to wear distance. It suggested leisure, connections, and protection from daily labor. But silk was delicate. It tore easily. It stained quickly. It was cold in winter and impractical in rain. It demanded careful movement and careful storage. Velvet, dense and plush, absorbed light and attention. It also absorbed heat. It was heavy. It restricted airflow. In warm halls filled with bodies and candles, velvet became stifling. Yet it was worn anyway, because luxury was not about ease. It was about presence. A noble's clothing had to convince others, visually, that they belonged above, that they were entitled to command space, time, and labor. Extra fabric signaled excess. Excess signaled authority. Long trains dragged behind bodies not by accident, but by intention. They slowed walking. They forced others to step aside. They reminded everyone that the wearer did not hurry. Wide sleeves dipped into food, brushed against surfaces, and required servants to manage them. This inconvenience was the point. If you could afford to be inconvenienced, you could afford help. Jewelry added sound. Rings clicked. Chains shifted, badges clinked softly. Luxury announced itself not only through sight, but through movement. All of this required money, and often more money than nobles actually had. Medieval elites frequently lived in debt. Maintaining appearance was expensive, and appearances had to be maintained. Court life demanded constant display. Garments wore out. Styles shifted. Rivals escalated. To fall behind visually was to fall behind politically. This pressure created cycles of borrowing, selling land, and extracting rents. Clothing was not a minor expense. It was a strategic investment. Because power was performative, people needed to see it. This is why sumptuary laws appeared again and again. Authorities attempted to limit who could wear certain fabrics, colors, and decorations. These laws were meant to stabilize hierarchy, to prevent merchants or artisans from visually approaching noble status. But enforcement was inconsistent. Loopholes were common. Ambition found ways around regulation. Fashion always moved faster than law. Comfort was rarely part of the conversation. Discomfort became normalized. Restrictive garments trained bodies into stillness and controlled movement. Heavy materials demanded upright posture. Elaborate clothing shaped how people sat, stood, and gestured. The body itself became disciplined by luxury. This discipline created distance. Distance created awe. A ruler weighed down by silk and velvet did not move like a laborer. Their stillness suggested thoughtfulness. Their slowness suggested importance. Their endurance of discomfort suggested superiority. Even pain could be transformed into authority. For women at court, luxury imposed additional burdens. Tight bodices, layered skirts, elaborate headgear. These garments restricted breath, balance, and mobility. They also communicated marital status, family alliances, and moral expectations. To dress well was to be legible in a competitive environment where every glance mattered. And yet, beneath all of this performance, there remained fragility. Clothing tore, colors faded, embroidery frayed, fires posed constant danger. One spark could undo years of investment. This risk heightened the drama. Court fashion lived close to failure. Wardrobe malfunctions were public. Trips, snags, and stains were noticed. But the performance continued. Because luxury was not optional. It was a language of survival within elite circles. As you rest here, imagine the weight of layered silk and velvet, the heat, the careful steps, the awareness of being watched. In the medieval world, luxury was not worn for pleasure. It was worn to convince. Heads, hair, and the burden of visibility. In the medieval world, the head was never neutral. It was the most visible part of the body, the first thing noticed in a crowd, the place where identity gathered and announced itself. And so, it was carefully managed. Head coverings were not accessories, they were signals. To step outside with an uncovered or improperly covered head was to say something, sometimes more than intended. Modesty, authority, marital status, profession, faith, and morality all gathered above the shoulders. For men, hoods were nearly universal. Practical at first glance, they protected from wind and rain, shaded the face, and provided warmth. But even these simple garments carried variation. Length, shape, and decoration mattered. Some hoods included long trailing extensions, not strictly useful, but noticeable. Movement caused them to sway and flick, turning practicality into subtle display. Hats followed similar rules. Soft caps, felted hats, stiffened shapes, each style belonged somewhere. To wear the wrong one invited comment. To remove it at the wrong time invited offense. For women, the rules were heavier. Hair was powerful. It was associated with sexuality, fertility, and temptation. Because of this, it was controlled. Uncovered hair in public often marked a woman as unmarried, morally questionable, or socially marginal. Married women covered their hair not only out of modesty, but out of expectation. Veils, wimples, coifs, each wrapped the head and neck, softening the outline of the face and obscuring the hair beneath. These coverings signaled respectability and order. The way they were worn mattered. A veil drawn too loosely could suggest carelessness. A wimple arranged precisely suggested discipline. small adjustments carried meaning. Then there was the hennin. Tall, conical, dramatic, and unmistakable, the hennin rose above the body like architecture. Often more than 2 feet high, it reshaped the wearer's silhouette completely. Balance became a skill. Movement slowed. Doorways required attention. The hennin was not comfortable. It strained the neck. It required pins, structure, and constant awareness. And yet, it was worn because it commanded attention. It elevated the wearer literally and symbolically. It transformed the body into a spectacle. Hair beneath these structures was treated carefully. In aristocratic circles, high foreheads became fashionable. Women plucked hairlines to create the illusion of height and refinement. This practice was painful, time-consuming, and irreversible in the short term. Pain became beauty. Discomfort became elegance. These ideals were not random. They reflected values. A high forehead suggested intelligence, control, and distance from physical labor. It implied that the wearer lived in a world of thought rather than toil. Men's hair followed its own codes. Length, beard style, and grooming communicated age, authority, and moral standing. Clerics shaved tonsures to mark religious devotion. Laymen followed trends cautiously, always mindful of appearing excessive. Hair and headwear shaped posture. They trained bodies into certain movements. Quick gestures were discouraged. Stability and calm were prized. This bodily discipline reinforced social order. If clothing shaped the body, headwear shaped presence. You did not rush when wearing a hennin. You did not bend casually in layered veils. You did not forget yourself when your head announced you before your voice did. Visibility demanded care, and because the head was so visible, mistakes were noticed. A slipping veil, a crooked hood, a fallen pin. These moments exposed vulnerability. They reminded everyone that performance required effort. In public spaces, headwear created hierarchy instantly. Who looked up to whom? Who was seen first? Who occupied visual space? In churches, head coverings reinforced reverence. In courts, they reinforced rank. In markets, they reinforced respectability. Even indoors, rules persisted. The medieval world did not separate private from public as sharply as we do. Appearance mattered almost everywhere. This constant awareness could be exhausting. It required attention. It required practice. It required conformity. But it also provided clarity. You knew how to read the world above you. You knew where to look. You knew how to behave. As night settles, imagine the weight of fabric around the head. The careful arrangement, the slight tension at the scalp, the sense of being held in place. In the medieval world, to cover the head was not to hide. It was to be seen correctly. Feet, movement, and the control of pace. In the medieval world, the way a person moved mattered almost as much as how they looked while standing still, and movement began at the feet. Shoes were among the most revealing elements of medieval dress. They spoke quietly but clearly about class, occupation, and expectation. Before someone spoke, before they gestured or negotiated, the condition and shape of their footwear had already offered an introduction. For most people, shoes were practical. Simple leather turn shoes, stitched inside out and then reversed, softened with wear, and molded to the foot over time. They were thin, flexible, and offered little protection from cold, damp, or sharp ground. They were not especially comfortable, but they allowed work. A laborer needed to walk, bend, lift, and move quickly when required. Shoes that restricted this would not last long. Worn soles were patched. When repair was no longer possible, shoes were discarded reluctantly, often replaced only when absolutely necessary. footwear wore down because bodies wore down. This relationship between shoes and labor was understood. A person with worn shoes was visibly engaged in work. Their pace reflected necessity rather than ceremony. But for the elite, shoes told a different story. In courtly circles, footwear became theatrical. Long, pointed shoes, often called poulaines or Krakow shoes, extended far beyond the toes. Some were so exaggerated that they had to be tied to the knees with cords to prevent tripping. These shoes made walking difficult by design. They shortened strides. They forced careful placement of the foot. They turned movement into a deliberate act. This was the point. To walk slowly was to signal that one did not need to hurry. To move carefully was to suggest that others would accommodate you. The inconvenience of these shoes demonstrated freedom from labor. Comfort was sacrificed intentionally. The body became part of the display. Movement itself was a form of language. A noble gliding slowly across a hall sent a message very different from a worker striding quickly through a street. Shoes controlled pace, and pace controlled perception. A slow body appeared, thoughtful, important, restrained. A fast body appeared busy, necessary, replaceable. This distinction mattered deeply in a society structured around hierarchy. Even posture changed. Pointed shoes altered balance. They encouraged upright stance and measured steps. The wearer became more aware of their own body, of the ground, of space. In this way, footwear trained behavior. Sumptuary laws occasionally attempted to regulate shoe length, especially when extremes became politically uncomfortable. But as with other aspects of fashion, enforcement was inconsistent. Excess returned again and again. Because shoes were visible, they moved. They entered rooms before the rest of the body. They left impressions in dirt and dust. Shoes marked presence. For women, footwear was often hidden beneath long skirts, but this did not remove its significance. Shoes still shaped gait. Heavy skirts combined with narrow shoes limited stride length. Movement became constrained, graceful, controlled. Walking was not about speed, it was about composure. In daily life, this meant that time unfolded differently. Distances were covered slowly. Transitions between spaces took effort. The body was always aware of clothing and ground. This awareness encouraged attentiveness. Modern comfort allows us to forget our bodies as we move. Medieval clothing and footwear made forgetting impossible. And this constant bodily awareness shaped thought. It slowed reaction. It encouraged observation. It discouraged impulsive movement. In crowded spaces, this mattered. Streets were narrow, markets were full. Animals moved alongside people. Fire, mud, and waste were common hazards. Careful movement was survival. So even among workers, footwear taught restraint. Shoes were thin, but steps were deliberate. The ground demanded respect. As you rest here, imagine walking in leather shoes that offer little cushioning. Each step felt, each surface noticed. Movement becomes conscious. In the medieval world, to walk was to participate in the social rhythm of the place you occupied. Shoes did not make life easier. They made it legible, work, faith, and the uniform of belonging. In the medieval world, clothing did not simply show who you were. It showed where you belonged. Work and faith shaped appearance as strongly as wealth or birth. To look at someone was often enough to know how they spent their days, who they answered to, and what rules governed their life. This was not accidental. Clothing became a kind of uniform long before uniforms were formally named. For working people, dress was shaped by necessity. Bakers, masons, blacksmiths, tanners, scribes, midwives, Each profession required protection from specific dangers: heat, sparks, dust, water, chemicals, blood, ink. Clothing adapted slowly, practically without ornament. Aprons protected bodies. Sleeves were shortened or tightened. Belts held tools. Hoods shielded faces from wind or debris. These garments were not decorative, but they were recognizable. A person could be identified by what they wore because their clothing carried traces of labor. Stains, wear patterns, reinforced seams. These marks were not hidden. They were accepted as evidence of usefulness. Work left visible marks on fabric, and this visibility created trust. You knew who knew how to do what. You knew whom to ask. Clothing acted as a silent resume. Guilds formalized this visibility: colors, badges, symbols, and coordinated garments appeared during festivals and processions. These displays were moments when work became identity, publicly affirmed and celebrated. To belong to a guild was to be protected, regulated, and recognized. Clothing made that belonging visible. Faith shaped appearance just as strongly. Clerics, monks, and nuns wore garments designed to reduce individuality. Habits erased difference. Color palettes were restricted. Silhouettes were uniform. These choices were deliberate. Religious clothing was meant to withdraw attention from the body and redirect it toward discipline and devotion. Comfort was not the goal. Restraint was. The roughness of fabric, the simplicity of cut, the repetition of the same garments day after day, all reinforced spiritual ideals. Clothing became a daily reminder of vows taken and desires renounced. Even in religious contexts, clothing communicated hierarchy. Rank within the church was visible. Vestments changed with the liturgical calendar. Color and ornament signaled authority and occasion. Faith, like work, used clothing to structure life. Children absorbed these lessons early. They learned which garments belonged in which spaces. Church clothing differed from work clothing. Festival clothing differed from daily wear. Each context had expectations. To wear the wrong clothing in the wrong place was not merely awkward, it was disrespectful. This emphasis on appropriate dress reinforced order. Everyone learned the boundaries. Everyone learned when to blend in and when to stand apart. Entertainers formed a notable exception. Their clothing deliberately disrupted norms. Bright colors, mismatched patterns, exaggerated shapes. They existed on the edge of respectability, allowed to break visual rules precisely because their role was to stand outside ordinary order. Their clothing marked them as liminal, neither fully inside nor fully outside society. This contrast made everyday conformity stronger. Most people did not want to stand out. They wanted to belong. Clothing offered that belonging. It allowed people to move through the world with confidence, knowing they would be read correctly, knowing they would not have to explain themselves constantly. In a world without badges, ID cards, or resumes, clothing did the work of recognition. As you let this part settle, imagine the comfort of being known without speaking, of stepping into a role that others immediately understand. In the medieval world, clothing made identity visible not to limit life, but to anchor it. Belonging mattered more than freedom, and clothing was how belonging was worn. The discomfort we never left behind. By now, it becomes clear that medieval fashion was never meant to be kind to the body. It was meant to be clear to the world. Clothing in the Middle Ages did not ask whether you felt at ease. It asked whether you were understood, whether you were legible, whether your body, wrapped in fabric, told the correct story to everyone who looked at you. Discomfort was not a flaw in the system. It was part of the system. Heavy cloth slowed people down. Restrictive garments disciplined movement. Layers controlled temperature but also posture. Shoes shaped pace. Headgear shaped attention. color shaped risk, fabric shaped fate. To live in medieval clothing was to live with constant awareness of the body. You felt weight on your shoulders. You felt tension at your waist. You felt fabric brushing your legs, pulling at your arms, warming your back, cooling your chest. You were never allowed to forget yourself. And that was the point. A body that is always aware of itself is easier to regulate, easier to place, easier to read. Medieval society depended on this visibility. It was a world where order was fragile and fear was close at hand. Disease arrived without warning. Crops failed. Wars disrupted lives overnight. Travel was dangerous. Justice was uneven. In such a world, appearance became a stabilizing force. If you could see where someone belonged, you knew how to behave toward them. If you could read their clothing, you could predict their role. Clothing reduced uncertainty. And so, people accepted discomfort because it offered something more valuable: predictability. Even rebellion expressed itself through clothing. New styles, exaggerated forms, forbidden colors. These were not casual choices. They were deliberate acts, visible challenges to authority, which is why they were regulated, criticized, and feared. Fashion mattered because it had power. What is unsettling when we look back quietly is how familiar this logic still feels. We like to believe that modern clothing is about freedom and comfort, that we dress for ourselves, that we have escaped the rigid codes of the past. But have we? We still read one another instantly. Shoes, brands, colors, fit. We still make assumptions about wealth, profession, seriousness, creativity, morality, and belonging based on appearance. We still dress for occasions. We still fear standing out in the wrong way. We still endure discomfort to signal status. High heels restrict movement. Formal wear slows bodies down. Uniforms enforce obedience. Luxury brands demand visibility rather than ease. Even casual clothing follows rules. What has changed is not the function of fashion, but its language. In the medieval world, the rules were explicit, written into law, enforced by community, understood by all. Today, the rules are quieter, but no less powerful. We are still dressed to be seen. We are still shaped by fabric. We are still disciplined by appearance. We are still communicating before we speak. And just like in the medieval world, comfort often comes second. Because clothing is not only about the body, it is about trust, about recognition, about belonging. It is about knowing how to move through a world filled with others. Medieval fashion reminds us that what we wear has always carried weight, not just physical weight, but social weight. It reminds us that clothing has never been neutral. It has always been language. And perhaps the most honest thing medieval clothing teaches us is this: that people have always been willing to endure discomfort in exchange for meaning. To be placed, to be understood, to be accepted. As the layers fall away in your imagination, as the weight of wool, linen, and structure slowly fades, you might notice something familiar. Even now, even here, we are never fully undressed of expectation. And in that quiet realization, the medieval world does not feel so distant after all. Let that thought rest. This has been Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. And now, as the last echoes of footsteps fade from stone streets, and the weight of fabric finally loosens in your imagination, it's time to let the past grow quiet again. The medieval world does not ask you to remember every detail. It does not ask you to judge it. It only asks that you notice how closely it still walks beside us. Clothing once shaped lives openly, through law, ritual, and visible order. Today, it does so more quietly, stitched into habits we rarely question. The fabrics have changed, the silhouettes have softened, but the language remains. What we wear still speaks before we do. So let the garments of history settle back into shadow. Let the weight lift. Let the rules loosen. You don't need to carry them forward tonight. If sleep is near, let it arrive gently. If thoughts wander, let them wander slowly. This story will remain here, folded carefully, waiting for another evening. Until then, you've been listening to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Rest well.